Let's say, for the sake of curiosity and nighttime musings, that you are suddenly spirited away, poof, right into the wooden belly of a 17th century Dutch spice ship, one operated by the VOC, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie. Ah yes, the Dutch East India Company, a name that rolls off the tongue like a buttered clog and smells faintly of nutmeg, sweat and despair. It's midday, though day is a bit of an abstract term, because the equatorial sun is less of a celestial body and more of a personal tormentor. It hangs above you, gleeful, unblinking, as if it too has a stake in the pepper trade. The deck of the ship creaks softly underfoot, not from charm or whimsy, but from thousands of leagues of damp wood tortured by sea and sun. Every square inch of timber has absorbed the screams of seasick teenagers and the philosophical grumbles of sailors paid mostly in dried peas. Now, let me set the record straight. Romantic though the age of sail may seem in oil paintings and coffee table books, the reality of VOC life was more corset rash than curtain call. First, your nostrils would revolt. The smell, dear listener, is an unmistakable blend of mouldy rope, vinegar-soaked canvas, goat, barrel-trapped cabbage, and men who haven't bathed since tulips were a new idea. Each sailor gets approximately 2 shirts per voyage. Both are worn at once, never washed, and considered heirlooms by the end. The air is thick, not in a literary, charged with dramatic intent kind of way. No, I mean you could slice this air into cubes and serve it with dinner. It's so humid near the equator that your body begins to question whether skin is strictly necessary anymore. Everything you own is damp. Your mattress, a sack of straw. Your bread, also a kind of sack of straw. And your sense of individuality. It all melts into a collective sponge of sogginess. Mealtimes are a daily descent into edible mystery. You're given a ladleful of hardtack porridge, which sounds marginally nourishing, until you notice it maintains its shape when turned upside down. Occasionally, there's salted fish, a food so aggressively briny it seems angry at you for eating it. The water, stored in barrels. By week 3, it's more lagoon than beverage. The solution? Mix it with a little vinegar and call it switchel, deliciously ineffective. Now, imagine trying to sleep in such conditions. 8 to a hammock, swinging shoulder to elbow on a narrow lower deck that smells like beef tallow and regret. You're lulled to sleep by the consistent drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the ceiling planks onto your nose, a sort of unrequested maritime metronome. And if the bilge rats don't nibble your boots, count yourself blessed by the patron saint of soggy toes, if there is such a figure. Time itself begins to blur. Days pass without punctuation, save for the striking of the ship's bell every half hour, the only halfway reliable clock in a place where the sun seems to rise and fall exclusively for the purpose of continuing your mild misery. Watches rotate. Conversations become philosophical in the way that only long deprivation and proximity to barrels can induce. Do you think peppercorns feel pain? Only when overboiled, I suppose. Despite all this, you might still dream under that swaying hammock netting. Perhaps of Java, of silky bales of cinnamon and cloves, or maybe of Amsterdam's crisp white sheets and clinking coffee cups on land that never rolls beneath your feet. The VOC men endured not just for gold and spice, but for the chance to escape the bite of European winters and return with their pockets slightly fuller and their teeth slightly fewer. Still, you plucked from the 21st century, lover of soft beds and central air, you wouldn't last a single sunset. The sunburn alone would reduce you to a whisper. And let's not even start on the scurvy. lemons, luxury, limes, practically myth. The vitamin C came mostly from hope and pickled cabbage juice, both quickly running dry. So rest easy, my modern friend. Be glad you're not currently elbow deep in bilge water or trying to tell sea biscuits from actual biscuits by candlelight. Drifting off here in the gentle embrace of linen-scented air is far superior to sleeping amid barrels of pickled mystery and a map loosely describing the Indian Ocean as probably more ocean. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now then, let the tide of sleep carry you gently forward. If you're imagining the mighty Dutch East India Company, yes, the VOC, as a stately armada of proud, salt-kissed ships briskly slicing through tropical waters under crisp white sails, allow me to softly shake the coconut out of your hands, because while those ships did indeed cut through seas, the slicing was more of a creaking, groaning splinter of effort, and any glamour quickly melted in the equatorial heat. Remember, these were floating medieval towns, jam-packed with scruffy men, volatile cargo, and the constant threatening smell of sun-baked codfish and foot. Let's clamber aboard, shall we? Picture the Batavia, a proper VOC merchant ship, roughly the size of a modern tennis court, but with less ventilation and considerably fewer strawberries and cream. If you were on one of these vessels amid the 1600s, you'd find yourself among some 150 to 250 souls. That's a lot of body heat in one big wooden box drifting across the tropics, like a sauna run by pirates who graduated from accounting school. The VOC didn't just transport spices, they ferried dreams slightly past the expiration date. Adventurers, soldiers, cooks, and carpenters, each with a vaguely defined job title and exactly one set of clothing for a 7-month voyage. Linen shirts turned slowly to brine-rubbed parchment. Trousers stiffened with a crust of salt and regret. You'd smell your bunkmate long before you saw his sun-scorched face peeking up from the hammock like a toasted mushroom. And although this maritime caravan boasted some of Europe's finest navigators, let's not pretend it was a spa cruise. Soldiers doubled as deck swabbers, officers passed round the discipline with sticks and lectures, and sailors, well, sailors mostly tried not to fall overboard or die of dysentery. Oh, dysentery, that dainty spectre of the age of sail. The VOC was well acquainted with it, bucket in hand, along with scurvy, malaria, typhoid fever, and good old-fashioned dental collapse. Healthcare aboard wasn't exactly comprehensive. The ship's surgeon, who may or may not have once practiced medicine, depending on how loosely you interpret apprenticeship, carried a kit of sharp tools and vague optimism. Cupping, bloodletting, lime juice if you were lucky, amputation if you weren't. But let's speak now of rats, because they played their part with commendable dedication. They frolicked in the grain, nibbled on seams, and occasionally serenaded the crew with midnight squeaks. In some corners of the ship, there were more rats than spoons. This is not a metaphor. Spoons were scarce, and no one wanted to share with the rodents. Now, if you hoped for a warm bath aboard the Batavia, the closest you'd get was sweating so much your shirt turned into a personal brine lagoon. Hygiene was rudimentary at best. After a few weeks at sea, your skin would politely request a transfer. Washing was discouraged. It wasted precious drinking water. Instead, people famously argued over whether vinegar could substitute for hope. Meals aboard were admirably consistent. Salted meat, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, and more salted meat. The biscuits, known for their pleasing granite texture, often came pre-populated with weevils, protein-rich and mildly crunchy. Sailors nicknamed them cowards because they fled when the lights came on. As for the water, it was stored in barrels and after a few months developed character, a greenish hue, slippery attitude. But drink it you must, for thirst was less romantic than it sounded. The equatorial sun added its own seasoning. Imagine wearing wool trousers in an attic during July while someone yells about rigging orders and someone else trims your beard with a rusty fish knife. The heat was relentless, the air damp and willing to fistfight, the smell a concerto of sweat, fish oil and disappointment, wafting gently among the sails like a love letter from Neptune's armpit. Still, they ventured on. These sailors, grimy, tired, sunburned into a shade not found in ordinary human skin, pushed their floating spice bazaars forward with a mixture of stubbornness and rum. They sang shanties with the volume of 5 too many tankards, and tied reef knots with fingers, bruised from hauling ambition up and over the mast day after day. And in this humid wooden limbo, this briny purgatory of splinters and salted prayers, many did not last. Disease claimed them. Accidents, disputes over weevils. But those who made it to Java or Ceylon would step ashore triumphantly, leaner, meaner, and about 10 kilograms saltier. But before anyone could smell dry land, first they had to conquer the wind, and the sea did not give it freely. Tomorrow, we rise with the sails and meet the wind itself, who had opinions of its own. If you have ever gazed at a modern spice rack and thought, these taste good, but they're not exactly life-threatening, then congratulations. You have not yet shipped out with the Dutch East India Company in 1642. In the pungent corridors of our story, we now step aboard one of the VOC's magnificent leviathans, a ship not so much a vessel of glory as it was a floating paradox of splendor and suffering. Though officially designated as a floit or galleon, a sleek pine and oak hybrid with sails puffed out like the cheeks of a nervous nobleman, you, dear listener, might experience it more as a mildly haunted pantry set loose upon the tropical sea. And if you manage to step aboard with high hopes, stretched stockings, and romantic notions of trade winds and adventure, well, those would be the first things to rot. The day begins with heat, not the gentle warmth of a sunny picnic or the comforting hug of a woolen blanket. No, this is the kind of heat that melts logic. The equator doesn't merely warm the air, it obliterates it. The thick, syrupy atmosphere clings to your lungs like a damp bread roll. Beneath 10 tons of spices, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and cinnamon, the whole becomes a perfumed sauna of lightly pickled humans. Sweat, despite its diligent efforts, never really leaves the skin. It just lives there now. Hammocks swing from the beams above, slung between barrels of goods and sailors of varying levels of consciousness. There isn't space, you see, for privacy or personal opinions. Your bed is a canvas bag suspended 3 feet above someone else's foot, and your sense of personal dignity was gently jettisoned somewhere off the coast of Cape Verde. Meals are served with a maritime flair, by which I mean they are mostly hardtack, tooth-chipping, barnacle-resembling biscuits that once made a Jesuit weep with despair. To accompany this oddly resilient bread, you'll enjoy a broth lovingly composed of whatever salted meat has not yet grown fur. Occasionally, a cook's assistant pulls a maggot from the stew, sighs dramatically, and adds it back in, for protein. And yet, it's not the food that breaks you. It's the little things, the ship's orchestra of creaks and groans during windless nights, the unsettling glances from Willem the carpenter, who insists he hears voices in the wood grain, the tropical itches achieved from one's intimate relationship with unwashed linens. And let us not forget the rats. Oh dear, almost poetic in their confidence, they stage nightly productions across the upper decks, performing interpretive gnawing and impromptu parades. Should you be offered the honor of mid-morning duties, you might be asked to assist the ship's barber surgeon. Not so much a man of medicine as a part-time philosopher with a hacksaw and opinions on phlebotomy. Complaints about heat exhaustion? Clearly, your humors are out of balance. Solution: 10 leeches, an alarming poultice, and a thump on the back to remind you of your Protestant values. Navigation is handled by a man who's been squinting at the stars for so many decades that he's permanently skeptical of them. With nothing but wind patterns, rough maps, grim determination, and a compass that may or may not point toward a magnetic rock near Sumatra, the helmsman charts a course based roughly on instinct and coughs. Every so often, a crewmate spots what appears to be land, only to realize it's either a hallucination or the greasy corner of someone's matted hair. But what's truly remarkable, what defies even the strongest ridicule, is that many aboard still believe that all this, boiled laundry arm soup, sunstroke-induced mutinies, the unplaceable itch behind the knee, is entirely worth it for the promise of spice, of fortune, of returning home one day with a pouch of nutmeg so valuable it could buy a row house in Amsterdam, a wife who pretends not to be alarmed by your new twitch, and perhaps most importantly, your name carved, slightly creatively, into a ledger of successful men. As the sun tips sideways into the sea and the decks moan beneath the weight of 1,000 regrets, you, soaked, sunburned, possibly hallucinating that the captain is a large bird, begin to accept that surviving another hour on this ship requires a certain kind of madness, the admirable, tragic, profitable kind. Now, as the canvas sails flap lazily in equatorial despair and a distant thundercloud chuckles to itself like an ancient fisherman, let us drift gently onward into the mysteries of the next ordeal. Very few people today willingly drink water that has been scooped out of a wooden barrel, fermented in tropical heat, and blended entirely by accident with the sweat of 9 different sailors, a lone rat, and the general essence of mildew. But aboard a 17th century VOC spy ship drifting placidly near the equator, such water didn't just exist, it was dined upon with reverence, because the alternative was not drinking. Fresh water, you see, was one of the first things to vanish on a voyage that could last months, or more optimistically, an unnecessarily long time. The VOC, also known as the Dutch East India Company, did its level best to prepare. Ships departed with great barrels of water, lovingly filled in Amsterdam, or occasionally, not so lovingly, siphoned in from canal runoff. And once those fresh barrels were sealed and stashed below deck, the countdown began, not to arrival, but to microbial paradise. Stored in close quarters, with tropical heat above and sweating sailors below, water did not stay water for long. It blossomed into a sort of soup, not Campbell's, but a unique sailor-style broth known as brackish bilge bouquet. Some referred to it more hopefully as small beer, thinned wine, or something wet. Others preferred to close their eyes, say a prayer, and drink quickly, lest their brain catch on to what their mouth was doing. Still, hydration was important. Dehydrated sailors made poor workers and worse conversationalists, so the VOC eventually kissed water goodbye and leaned heavily on beer and wine to do the job water once did. Beer, lower in alcohol, was safer to drink than the water, and the wine. Well, it didn't always age gracefully in the blazing hold of a sailing warehouse, but it reliably did two things. It killed bacteria and dulled your awareness of the worms in your biscuit. Of course, even the beer supply had limits, and nowhere on any spice ship manifest did it say infinite alcohol budget. Crews sometimes rationed a single litre of grog, rum diluted with water, per day. Though depending on the temperament of the captain, that might be a generous lie. If you were feeling especially cheeky and morally unconcerned with stealing from your employer, you might sneak a ladle of vinegar, stir it into water, and create what passed for lemonade in desperate times. The irony, of course, was that these voyages were headed toward lands blooming with the things that could make grog, or even rancid water, palatable. Spices, fruits, new trade routes full of citrus and cinnamon. But to get there, you had to survive the journey, and that meant drinking wine with vinegar notes, spiked by heat and despair, knowing there wouldn't be a lemon in sight until you sighted Java. Curiously, despite all this liquid chaos, thirst wasn't the most dangerous consequence of poor drink. That distinction belonged to scurvy, our old friend, the vitamin C deficiency that turned gums into bleeding pillows and made your limbs feel like overcooked eels. Even with all that ocean around you, if you didn't have fruit, you might die of thirst for an orange. Some captains, the forward-thinking sort, stocked dried lemon peel or a few barrels of pickled cabbage. Others, naturally, did not. And so, the crew preened their teeth into oblivion while sipping a vintage called whatever was in the bottom of that cask. There were also the occasional medical interventions. Shipboard surgeons, often trained in the fine art of guesswork, sometimes prescribed hot beer and mustard seed poultices to purify the blood. The only thing this accomplished was the sudden reconsideration of how bad the original illness truly was. And if you ever doubted that desperation leads to innovation, consider that some sailors learned to collect rainwater using stretched out sailcloth, funneling the drops into jugs like eager poets. For a few brief damp days, they'd sip something fresh, something unfermented, something that didn't taste faintly of shoe. You'd think that in such constant thirst, mutiny would boil a bit faster. But oddly, the absence of good drink often bred a sort of unity. Fellowship forged in the fellowship of awful taste. One sailor's ruined wine was another sailor's emotional support beverage. They toasted the moon with whatever they had left. They laughed at nothing as drunkards often do. And occasionally, when hopes were parched and the sky was generous, they sang. The horizon stretched on, a mirage of mangoes and rum still weeks away. But that didn't stop them from dreaming. Of Java, of fruit, of water that didn't make you sick. Tomorrow, when the sun rose again and slapped the deck with its humid hand, they would fight off heat with yet another mug of warm dreams, if there was any left in the barrel. And further below deck, behind crates of cloves and tightly packed greed, something gently shifted in the dark. The equator, dear dreamer, is not merely an imaginary line sketched across the middle of a globe by cartographers with an eye for symmetry and a love for geometry. No, it is a far more temperamental entity when encountered aboard a 17th century Dutch East India Company spice ship, like the Batavia, the Arnhem, or one of their creaking, wheezing cousins. It is where the sun reduces propriety and perspiration to puddles, a place where your skin becomes a sticky theatre of humidity and your musket-ready wool tunic becomes an unrequested sauna. It was, in no uncertain terms, where sailors learned what it truly meant to stew in one's own juices, marinated generously in salt and regret. Crossing the equator was often referred to as entering the doldrums, a word which sounds deceptively poetic, like a type of musical instrument or perhaps a melancholic cousin of the tulip. In reality, it was a band of chaotic stillness where the wind forgot how to exist. VOC ships might bob hopelessly for weeks, sails limp as overcooked cabbage, beneath a sky so cloudless it was almost smug about it. No wind meant no movement. No movement meant no breeze. No breeze meant infinite chances to bond with the company of your own sweat. The scent of dozens of men who had not bathed in weeks, sometimes months, now ripening like communal cheese under the equatorial sun, well, that could curdle your soul. To make things even more charming, food stores were beginning to put up an aromatic protest of their own by this point in the voyage. Salted pork, which already tasted like a wallpaper sample dipped in brine, had grown fuzzy beards of green and grey. Ship's biscuit, that rock-hard snarling remnant of flour and ambition, had become less a food and more a habitat for weevils, maggots, and the occasional wide-eyed cook attempting denial. Sailors learned to tap their hardtack against the table, bang, bang, like a warning shot. That would usually coax out a small parade of insects, which could then be flicked away before chewing began. Waste not, want not, after all. They were on a spy ship, yes, but cinnamon was earmarked for rich Europeans, not culinary rescue. And water. Ah, the water. Once fresh and brimming with hope, it had now transformed into a languid soup of algae and amoebas, stored in barrels long enough to begin philosophical conversations with each other. Every gulp a gamble, a roulette wheel of nausea. The barrels themselves groaned with age and sourness, as though unhappy with the company they kept. This was also the time when a peculiar and ancient rite would stir among the crew, the equator crossing ceremony. A mixture of naval tradition and sanctioned hazing. It involved King Neptune, a pretend court, excessive shouting, and the gleeful humiliation of new sailors, or pollywogs. If you were new to ocean life, you'd be mock-tried, dunked, smeared with mystery sludge, usually expired provisions cleverly repurposed, and declared a shellback, forever changed, and possibly still smelling of pickled herring. It was an attempt at morale, really, an absurdity to pierce monotony, and for the VOC, it had the added benefit of distracting men from the more pressing existential concerns, such as, if the wind doesn't pick up, are we simply going to float here forever? This was where the first real strains began to show. Not in the wood of the hull, though that shrieked and twisted under the sun like a sunburned violin, but in the minds of the crew. The letters home no longer imagined spices as golden treasure, but as volatile, faraway nonsense. Dreams of nutmeg fields were replaced by the simple fantasy of a lemon, a bath, or a breeze. Still, the ships pressed on slowly when the wind permitted. They crept forward across the belt of the world, where the sea sweats and the air simmers. Some would drop anchor at tropical ports along the way, Cape Verde or Ascension Island, where goats outnumbered people and coconuts could be mistaken for divine gifts. But for most, it was a forward crawl through equatorial purgatory, with hope curled up in a hammock and snoring behind a barrel. And as the sun dipped again into the directionless horizon, painting the sweaty world in a humid gold, the crew prepared for another windless night and the slow shuffle towards stranger dangers beyond the equator's line. Dangers with sharper teeth than mildew and mold. Soon, the heat would not be the worst of their complaints. Soon, the human element, always more unpredictable than any storm, would start to rise. And we will drift there, into that mutinous current, when the moon wheels quietly above the sails, far below the turbulent decks and sticky tropical air, tucked beneath layers of groaning oak and tarred rope, lived an entirely different world aboard a VOC spice ship. It was the domain of the ship's hold. Not exotic cargo, no, but the men tasked with preserving said cargo from mice, mildew, and that relentless twin terror, heat and humidity. You see, clothes may be worth their weight in gold, but mildew doesn't care about your economics. These hardy souls, unofficially known as the hold goblins by their gaunt crewmates, had one job: to keep hundreds of sacks of peppercorns, nutmeg and cinnamon from turning into a fuzzy grey ecosystem of rot and despair. In fairness, no one officially called them that, not out of kindness, but because speaking in the hold guaranteed a mouthful of coffee-scented sweat and dust thick enough to scour your teeth. Now, imagine it. You, crawling between barrels in a ship's underbelly, sweating enough to water a rice paddy, sackcloth wrapped around your head in a hopeful, but mostly useless, attempt to filter out mold spores. The air, less breathable, more chewable. A stale blend of damp wood, acrid salt, and the indisputable tang of foot. There were no air vents, only the occasional whimper of a candle fighting for oxygen. It wasn't uncommon for the candle to win this particular battle, only to dramatically expire moments later, leaving you face to face with your own poor life decisions in absolute darkness. And yet, somehow, the East India Company expected these men to not only survive, but to maintain inventory. Daily, salted fish, sacked spices, bolts of cloth, barrels of Dutch gin, prioritized always. Keeping count was a logistical ballet performed with dull quills, soggy ledgers, and an impressive tolerance for low-stakes existential dread. Worse, the ship's journey near the equator was essentially a spa treatment for mold. You might lovingly wrap each nutmeg in linen like a precious infant, only to come back 2 days later and find it sporting a lush green beard and what looked suspiciously like a monocle. The Dutch called it het schimmelschip, the mold ship, and while no one spoke the phrase out loud, it lingered in everyone's damp hearts. Meanwhile, just meters above the hold, the cook did his noble best to stew desperation into edible form. The result was invariably some combination of pea porridge, salt pork, and a mystery pudding that rattled like an angry maraca when jostled. The pudding, known affectionately as wiggle slab, thrived on humidity and moral ambivalence. Oftentimes, a sailor would poke it with his spoon, as if to remind himself that his dignity still existed. It was unclear if this helped. Hydration, too, was not immune to chaos. You might think the world's largest sea offered unlimited water, but desalination in the 17th century involved either boiling or wildly unrealistic optimism. Shipboard drinking water was kept in barrels and did its best to ferment slightly by day 4. By week 2, it was not so much water as it was a biological soup, enhanced with insect life and a faint scent of feet. It was best enjoyed with one's nose covered and spirits low. And then, as if the gods were feeling cheeky, the ship's carpenter would routinely pound his hammer overhead, fixing yet another leaking plank from below the waterline as the creaking timbers protested dramatically. Every passenger, whether sailor or spice hoarder, grew used to the sound of nails stubbornly inserted into damp wood, while also praying those nails were, in fact, going where they ought. And so life in the hold passed, with spice guards scribbling fading numbers on decaying parchment, the cook ladling wiggle slab with philosophical indifference, and the water barrel slowly becoming more adventurous by the hour, It was a symphony of wet misery and low-grade courage, all in pursuit of marketable cinnamon. But one day, without any particular announcement, a change arrived. The winds held their breath, the boards of the ship sighed differently, and the evening's air brought not the usual mildew, but a whiff of something far more sinister: illness. Which reminds me, we haven't yet discussed scurvy. A few hundred nautical miles past the last island you could name, somewhere in the slippery swell of the Indian Ocean, the spice ship lumbers on, not unlike a floating barn built by someone who'd read a book about shipbuilding once and then promptly ignored it. Everything creaks. The ropes creak. The planks creak. Even the shadows clinging to the barrels seem to creak with boredom. But what truly creaks the most, dear listener, is the morale. After weeks of hostile humidity, the crew begins to succumb to a tropical phenomenon known informally as falling apart emotionally. You could dress it up in nautical terms, call it an ebbing of esprit de corps, a shift in mental tide. But really, it's just about everyone slowly losing their marbles under the equatorial sun. One of the greatest adversaries on a VOC, that's the Dutch East India Company. For those drifting in and out of consciousness, spice ship wasn't pirates or storms, or even the tyrannical cook, nicknamed the Ladle of Doom. No, it was dysentery and heat rash, and the sort of moist inner thigh situation that comes from wool trousers fused to skin. You see, VOC uniforms were designed for dignity, not utility. Wool, lace, leather, all splendid when hosting a tea in Amsterdam, significantly less so when trying not to go insane while scraping barnacles off the hull in 104-degree heat. The Dutch had conquered half the globe's trade routes, but tragically had yet to invent shorts. Below decks, the situation devolves into something that smells like a stew but moves like a fog. The air is hot gravy. You can chew it. Hammocks sway over barrels of peppercorns while sailors attempt to nap without touching anything. Air, each other, their own misgivings. The ship's carpenter, previously bearish and full of tales about carp and mermaids with poor decision-making skills, now mostly speaks in single-word sentences, sweating. God. Again. More concerning is the fellow known only as Bente, who has taken to whispering secrets to the cinnamon cargo. The cinnamon, being dried bark, is as good a listener as any. Frankly, better than the bosun, who growls at sunrise and refers to the equator as the devil's belt buckle. There's no privacy either. Bathing, such as it exists, involves an old bucket nailed to the rail and the vague promise of rain. A lucky sailor might get a sponge and enough water to rinse half a shoulder. Anything more luxurious would be suspected of witchcraft, or worse, Portuguese influence. Keeping morale from sliding directly into the sea is typically the job of the musician, a fiddler named Klaus, who can play only 3.5 tunes. He used to know 6, but the 4th string gave out sometime near Madagascar, and now he's improvising on a loop with what he calls emotional variations. The songs still technically change, but only in the same way a stew changes after 17 days of reboiling. It's music, but mostly as a rumor. Meals are no help to anyone. Salted fish, salted biscuits, salted debate about whether this fish was previously a boot. Salt touches everything. Even your dreams begin to feel briny. You wake from an afternoon doze on a sweaty plank pillow, convinced you're a pickled herring. Still, somehow, the ship creeps forward, propelled by wind, grit, and the sheer stubbornness of exhausted men who've come too far to swim home. Somewhere ahead lies the promise of Java, Sumatra, exotic heat, and unfamiliar fruits, that may or may not be secretly poisonous, but that's for another day. Tonight, the sea slops patiently against the hull like an old dog licking an empty bowl. Above, stars hang in soggy velvet, uncaring but spectacular. And if you listen closely, you might catch Klaus playing a version of Home on the Wobbling Sea, entirely in F-flat, which, to be honest, doesn't exist, but neither does logic out here. As the lanterns dim and the deck breathes in slow, pine-sweet groans, someone whispers a question into the dark. Do penguins live near the equator? No answer comes, which is good, since it suggests at least one sailor knows they don't. But hallucinations wait in the wings, and tomorrow might involve a mutinous debate about the migratory habits of birds that absolutely don't feature in this climate. Sleep now, the wind's changing, and tomorrow brings something new. Land in sight, or possibly just the cook's hat caught in the rigging again. Either way, you'll want to be awake. Kind of. Life aboard a VOC spy ship was, in several important ways, like being trapped in a giant wooden sauna, filled with damp cheese, armed men, volatile spices, and rotting planks that creaked with the haunted rhythm of impending tetanus. And if the oppressive heat didn't make you question your life choices, the food would politely finish the job. Let's talk, if you're brave, about the rations. Imagine, if you will, waking up at dawn to a breakfast that could comfortably double as a punishment. Biscuit, not the warm, buttery sort that might swoon beside a cup of tea. No, this was hardtack, a gritty rectangle of flour and water, baked into what archaeologists now describe as prehistoric drywall. It could survive a typhoon, a rat infestation, and possibly a small cannonball. So naturally, you gnawed on it, while pretending your molars were tools of naval destiny. To wash it down? Water. Or rather, an old wooden interpretation of water. Stored for weeks in heavy barrels, it grew eccentric with time. It developed a certain personality, mossy, sour, and possibly opinionated. Some of the more delicate sailors took to calling it green soup. The more experienced ones simply stared into the mug and remembered childhood fondly. Lunch meant salted meat, most often beef or pork, aged in barrels and encrusted with so much salt, it could have been mistaken for a rock sample. The salt wasn't just for flavor, it was to bully the bacteria into silence. Not always successfully. And if you were lucky, or unlucky, depending on the day's temperature and your olfactory thresholds, you might get a scoop of peas. These weren't the plump green globes beloved in garden beds. Oh no, these were dried peas, long past their prime and often containing bonus larvae. Always a treat. And yet, this food kept the ship afloat more than any sail or anchor. It gave the crew just enough strength to hoist cargo, scrub decks, climb the rigging, and argue intensely over the philosophical implications of rotted cheese. Because cheese there was. Dutch cheese, dense and round, sometimes used as a weapon or a bargaining chip. Mice were obsessed with it. So were sailors. The difference being that mice didn't have to pay 5 stivers for it. But while the food might have made a strong case for desertion, it was scurvy that made no case at all. Scurvy is what happens when you eat everything, except something with vitamin C. Your gums swell, your teeth wobble like dancehall patrons in a storm, and your mood becomes, let's call it, unreasonably murderous. The VOC, bless their frugal hearts, weren't especially worried at first. Lemons were expensive. Sailors, on the other hand, were technically replaceable. It wasn't until ships started arriving with only half their crews still intact that even the most budget-conscious merchant thought, maybe an orange wouldn't hurt. Eventually, citrus was quietly smuggled into the menu like a peacekeeping lemon hostage. Officers got it first, sailors could earn it. And of course, Captain Cornelis van Buren, who believed in progressive punishment, used limes as both a reward and a threat. "Show me a clean deck," once hollered, "and you may sniff this orange." Of course, there were other delights to chew. Ship's biscuit sometimes came, laced with weevils, tiny beetles who, in their gentle defense, simply wanted to nibble in peace. The crew avoided picking them out. They preferred to eat them with the biscuit, arguing that weevils added crunch, and perhaps, if you closed your eyes and squinted, protein, tea, rare, coffee, scarcer still. But there was beer, of a flat room temperature consistency that made one nostalgic for sobriety. It was weak but safe, safer than water anyway, and it was technically food. So men drank, burped, and got back to work. And in the tropical heat, as the ship bobbed endlessly near Java or Ceylon, surrounded by a sea that shimmered with both beauty and indifference, dinners were consumed slowly, interrupted by the thwack of a mosquito or the half-hearted pleading of a galley cook, holding up something once called stew. It was not glamorous, it was not gourmet, but it was history's most persistent catering experiment, afloat on a sea salted less by waves than by the meat. As the ship creaked into twilight and the stars blinked softly above, the bell tolled for second watch. Men climbed to their posts under moonlight, bellies full of salt, mouths dreaming of oranges, and hearts humming songs full of longing, cheese, and the distant memory of actual meals. Now, let's step off the galley and climb onto the upper deck, where another storm's been patiently waiting to meet its cue. Somewhere just north of nowhere, the sea had been flat for days. Not calm, but flat, as if the ocean were sulking under the oppressive gaze of the equatorial sun, refusing to ripple even slightly under the breathless air. The sails, once proud canvases swollen with ambition, now hung like laundry on a windless Tuesday. Aboard our creaky VOC spice ship, men grew sluggish, tempers thinned like soup after payday. And you, had you been there, might have started to understand why boredom, heat, and salted meat made such unlikely bedfellows. Now, heat on a tropical island is one thing. There at least, it's shared with chirping birds, lush shade, and something mildly resembling fruit. But heat on the open sea, that is a different creature. A wide, yawning furnace of reflected misery. The sun did not simply warm the day. It pressed down without apology, turning the pitch between deck planks into a slow dripping threat to all bare feet. And you wouldn't have worn shoes. Shoes were for shore leave or mutinies, usually. To pass time, you might have tried talking. Not a great plan. The man beside you, Jan with the laugh like breaking crockery, had told the same story about shaving a monkey for luck 19 times. It wasn't your favorite the first time, and by the 9th, you were starting to root for the monkey. Reading a book, a charming idea. Except paper was rationed, used mostly for logs, official reports, and rather apologetic letters home. No recreational novels. The best you could hope for was to sneak a glance at the back of a spice inventory list, which, on one occasion, one young sailor did attempt to dress up dramatically. He declared, "Ah, a shipment of cloves, bold, aromatic, I dare say scandalous," before being gently heaved into the shade for a sit-down nap and possibly a mild intervention. Chess would have been a fine pastime too, but small wooden pieces had a shocking tendency to roll into impossible corners of the ship, or worse, into the sea, followed by arguments so passionate they could wake the bosun from a rum nap. And so, most men turn to the only reliable companion on that sluggish journey, daydreaming. Not a lofty, poetic sort of daydreaming, no. This was the sort that begins with, "What if I were a beetle in a cool pantry?" and ends 4 hours later when someone coughs the wrong sort of cough and everyone panics. Because, yes, the great equalizer of the VOC, mysterious illnesses that turn strong seamen into weakly ghosts right before your very squinting eyes. Sicknesses had airs and personalities on these voyages. One day it was scurvy, creeping in on thin gums and sailor limbs that bent like old celery. Another day, dysentery, more commonly known as the hurry-ups, a condition which sailors faced with stoic, if soggy, resignation. You'll forgive the phrase buckets of trouble being taken quite literally. Some turned to the ship's barber surgeon for miracles. He had, perhaps optimistically, organized his tools in a neat little wooden box, knives, needles, hooks, and a 2/3 empty jar of something suspiciously labeled aqua vitae. Whether this was for disinfecting wounds or dulling pain, you had to guess. But either way, the cure often felt worse than the fever. The better informed crew turned to traditional nautical medicine, chewing bark, drinking vinegar, and the occasional heartfelt prayer to St. Elmo. No, not the fire nor the Brat Pack movie, though both have oddly similar effects on one's mental state. Still, your greatest enemy wasn't disease nor dehydration. It was ennui, the slow, syrupy nothingness of the doldrums. You might think you quite enjoy doing nothing. Perhaps you've even declared a lazy Sunday to be your spiritual home. But this was not restful idleness. This was an endless waiting room with salt in the air and occasional dolphin mockery. Oh yes, the dolphins. They'd come up alongside the ship, twirling and clicking with a sort of bright energy that made you wonder, were they happy or just being smug? Regardless, nothing dents a sailor's morale quite like being outsmiled by a fish. And yet, despite all this, despite the sun and the soup heat, and the creeping fungal conspiracies festering in your boots, the ship plodded toward treasure or trade, or just another port where the coconuts weren't salted. It was, as the Dutch would say, vooruit met de geit, forward with the goat. An expression braided into the beards of every hopeful sailor. Tomorrow, perhaps, the wind will blow again. Perhaps the sails will billow, and the sea will shimmer not with stagnant heat, but with motion, promise, and the faint smell of nutmeg in the breeze. Perhaps, but for now, best to rest your salty head and drift gently into dreams of cooler shores. For the next true challenge is just over the sun-cracked horizon. As the sun heaved itself reluctantly above the watery horizon, casting a golden shimmer across the swollen planks of the ship's deck, the men of the VOC, those poetic souls of commerce and constipation, faced the mighty challenge of yet another equatorial breakfast. A meal, if we may be generous with the term, that did not so much inspire the appetite as wrestle it into submission. Forget the romantic tropes of barrels bursting with exotic spices. Aside from the occasional cinnamon fug wafting up from below decks, where casks of precious nutmeg and cloves were exiled under lock and plenty of suspicion, not a trace of aromatic delight ever reached a sailor's plate. That's because all the good stuff was for the customers. You got gruel. Gruel so grey, it seemed flavoured only with the desperate sighs of the cook and the ambient moisture of the Indo-Pacific air. Ship rations, or victuals if you're feeling 17th century and unnecessarily formal, were regulated by the Herensikkerentienthi back in the Netherlands. Men who, one suspects, had never once tried to spread salted fish paste on a biscuit, tough enough to serve as emergency hull patching material. Hardtack commanded the breakfast table, or rather, the breakfast lap, since seasoned VOC men knew better than to rest their breakfast anywhere near a table. Tables creaked, tables tilted, tables flung your meal into the sea with all the ceremony of a bored matador. Each sailor was allotted precisely 1 pound of ship's biscuit per day. They were square, vaguely weaponizable, and entirely resistant to weevils. Until they weren't. You see, if you sailed long enough from Amsterdam to Java, your biscuits developed their own subculture inside the canvas sack. Little black beetle families would settle in, raise generations, perhaps even host tiny community events. Sailors knew to bang the biscuit on the table before eating it, not to soften it, but to chase the residents out. Not for sanitation, mind you, but because it was polite to give tenants notice before devouring their home. This crusty fare was often accompanied by salted meat, fowl, beef, or pork, preserved in brine so intense it doubled as paint stripper. It's said the meat was so salty that even sharks recoiled when a discarded bit floated past. The trick, of course, was to soak it in your limited daily supply of water, which thus transformed your drinking ration into a kind of meat consommé. Fancy. Freshwater rationing was as mathematical as it was maddening. Each sailor received approximately 1 quart per day, which had to suffice for drinking, cooking, and the occasional necessity of rinsing out one's undergarments. Not that anyone remembered what rinsed undergarments were supposed to smell like. Rum, thankfully, was not shy aboard a VOC ship, though the Dutch favoured a warming swig of Geneva, a proto-gin, stubbornly herbal and shockingly effective at blurring the existential questions you might have about eating boiled turnips for dinner. Again, turnips, of course, being what passed for vegetables at sea, unless you were one of the lucky few to get pickled cabbage, or as some called it, sour hope. Yet not everything eaten was planned or issued. Nature, delightful and morally ambiguous, often provided surprises. Flying fish occasionally launched themselves aboard, bringing brief moments of protein and general enthusiasm. One sailor claimed he befriended a flying fish and taught it tricks, a statement met with poignant silence from the rest of the crew and the quiet clink of another empty rum bottle. And for dessert, maggots, accidental, plentiful, and laughably familiar. By week 5, there were less intrusions and more reluctant table guests, a sign that your biscuit had reached peak maturity. Eating aboard a VOC ship near the Equator was less about taste than survival. Less cuisine, more endurance trial. But when the winds were kind and the stars spilled their silver across an indifferent sky, a sailor might lean back, salt-flecked and full of something technically edible, and feel briefly satisfied, or at least not quite dead. There was, however, one meal the men actually looked forward to, a day celebrated across decks with a kind of reverent mischief. It involved music, mildly dangerous games, and the ritual shaving of particularly unlucky crewmen. But for now, we leave the crew picking weevils from their biscuits, squinting at the horizon, and wondering if that smell is breakfast, or just the cook again. There is a particular hour just after midday on a VOC spice ship near the Equator, where time forgets itself entirely. The sails hang limp like overcooked noodles, the ocean glistens like molten pewter, and the sun, relentless, theatrical, clearly seeking attention, slathers everything in shimmering discomfort. It's in this hour stomachs faint and tempers ferment. And should you, dear listener, eagerly decide to last even half a day at sea, it's this hour that might unmake your resolve entirely. You see, In all its dreamy grandeur, the golden age of the Dutch East India Company was a bit of a mirage. The creamy tales of caches of cinnamon and mountains of nutmeg tend to skip the small detail that all of it came covered in sweat, sunburn, and a kind of collective madness induced by tropical heat and insufficient drinking water. Let's talk about that thirst, shall we? The VOC, in all its Baroque brilliance and precisely balanced ledgers, had not mastered the art of cooling anything. Their ships were floating furnaces by this point on the journey. Water barrels, lovingly filled back in Amsterdam by men with feathered hats and hopeful hearts, had, after weeks under the sultry sun, turned into a sort of stew, water tinged with oak, mildew, and a light bouquet of regret. Drinking it quenched one's thirst in the way shouting calms a toddler, momentarily and with inevitable consequences. One might imagine sailors finding respite under deck, but beneath was a sunless crypt of wood and rope, where mould roamed free like it paid rent, and the air was warm enough to slow your thoughts. Men slept nestled beside crates of cloves, their dreams perfumed but their backs crooked. They'd sometimes lie awake, not out of insomnia, but because their hammocks felt like ovens, and the sound of the ship creaking made them contemplate mutiny, or at least a brief, expletive-filled diary entry. Speaking of hammocks, many of them had to be shared in shifts. Hot bunking, they called it, which sounds like a dance craze, but was more a game of musical beds without the music and with a lot more sweating. The previous sleeper's warmth, somehow still radiating from the ropes, greeted the next lad with a damp handshake of inevitability. Above deck, anyone caught dozing risked a sunstroke or a shoe to the ribs from an officer insisting they adjust a sail that refused to catch even a whisper of wind. The sails were motionless pennants of despair, and the air so still you could hear your own paws trying to escape your body. Amid this languid chaos, people turned odd. The cabin boy might start humming sea shanties backwards. The gunner, whose job was irrelevant this far from enemy ships, took to stealing lemons and talking to them. The ship's cat, a half-blind creature named Meanhere Pudding, was quietly in charge of morale, sleeping through 18-hour stretches and curling up in extra clothes with an enviable sense of self-mastery. Food became philosophy. Each crumbling hardtack biscuit, when not secretly colonized by weevils, became a central point of meditation. Some men swore chewing slowly prevented hallucinations. Others learned to eat with their eyes closed, to avoid both the look and taste of what passed for soup in a rolling kettle. And then there was the matter of sweat. Sweat, dear dreamer, was not merely a biological process on these ships. It was a social glue, a currency of suffering. Everyone sweated, constantly. It dripped from noses into journals. It seasoned every meal unintentionally, and it brought men together in the most democratic way one could imagine. Everyone was soaked, drenched, equally repellent. Officers tried perfumes, sailors tried superstition. One man swore that scratching behind the ears kept the heat at bay. A boatswain wrote letters home, detailing a dream in which it snowed on deck, causing mass hysteria and joyful, delusional snowball fights with salted bacon. Perhaps it's the sun to blame. Perhaps it's the sea. Or perhaps it's something deeper, something stitched into the absolute absurdity of humans trying to carry Europe across the waves inside wooden boxes. But either way, by mid-afternoon, soaked inside and out, scorched from above and within, the ship floated, the climax of a long sigh. But the wind, you'll be glad to know, always returned eventually, not with fanfare, never on time, sometimes not before a man wept into a barrel of mace. But it came. In the meantime, the crew became walking shadows, sticky, sunburned sons of fortune, clinging to the dream of breezes, spices, and a destination that still felt like a myth wrapped in sand and peppercorns. Soon, the skies would flirt with the idea of rain, and with it, an entirely different kind of chaos. But that, dear sleeper, is another moment carried by another cloud. It was not the cannonballs or the piracy, or even the rationed beer that brought most men to their knees aboard a VOC ship in the tropics. No, it was something far more insidious, something quiet, warm, relentless, humid. Yes, it was the air itself. Somewhere near the equator, the act of simply breathing became an act of resignation. The ship's wooden hull groaned its discontent beneath a limp flag, and every man above deck glistened like a poached herring basking on a splintered plank. The heat was a sticky, demanding presence, less like weather and more like an over-friendly ghost that clung to your skin and whispered, "You shall simmer now." During these bloated equatorial days, the concept of clothing was reduced to the barest of suggestions. Shirts hung open, breeches drooped, shoes left behind entirely, if not eaten by entropy or rats. Those unfortunate enough to be fully clothed had usually just finished a punishment, an extra wool layer, the indignity of purity in a world that ran on grime. The Dutch East India Company, formerly known as the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, because everything sounds more dramatic in Dutch, didn't really plan for comfort. Profit, yes. Logistics, occasionally. But comfort had to walk the plank early in the voyage, likely somewhere near the Bay of Biscay, which is why, in this molten stretch of sea, fabric and hygiene were both fading fancies. By midday, the tar sealing the ship's seams softened under the sun and oozed lazily like molasses on a Sunday. Crew members avoided leaning on anything darker than a rotten potato, lest their shirts fuse with the ship itself. You could always spot a new sailor by the telltale peel of cloth left behind on a sun-hot railing. One young lad from Harlem once leaned dreamily against a scuttlebutt near noon and needed 3 men, a cup of goose grease, and a prayer to detach his elbow. And then there were the insects. Oh yes, if the heat didn't soften your resolve, the insect community surely would. Those warm waters were a fertile breeding ground for flying things with opinions. Mid-journey mosquitoes buzzed like gossiping harpies, obsessed with ear holes and general discontent. Cockroaches, permanent tenants of every hold, tapped Morse code sermons in the night. Repent, they seemed to say, or at least clean that salted fish barrel. To manage all this wild orchestra of warmth and torment, the crew embraced a kind of slapstick stoicism that would put any modern office worker to shame. Swatting became the national sport, sweating an act of diplomacy, and sleep, rare, precious, and always interrupted by the aroma of someone else's toes. For relief, there was the sailor's beloved freshwater bath, which involved an artfully balanced barrel and a bucket, and ended with a lukewarm drizzle mildly reminiscent of old turnips. It wasn't exactly rejuvenating, but it was at least wet, which qualified it as a luxury. And yet, remarkably, no one mutinied over the climate. They saved their outrage for biscuit ratios and wage disputes. The weather, you see, was shared, oppressive and democratic. It toasted everyone in equal measure, from the greenest cabin boy to the aging helmsman clutching his astrolabe like a teddy bear. Now, in the wavy haze of mid-afternoon, when the shadows shrank to the width of a sword blade, the ship would fall into a stupor. Even the parrots, stowaways from forgotten ports stopped screaming and sat gloomily on their ropes, blinking slowly like underpaid oracles. And in that quiet, with only the creak of the timbers and the soft sputtering of a sailor's interrupted dream, it was possible, very briefly, to forget the boils, the fleas, and the sweat-drenched bunks. Instead, one could gaze out upon the glassy sea, stretching unbreaking and patient in all directions, and imagine that this was exactly what adventure was supposed to feel like, if your adventure included damp sheets and mysterious foot rashes. But the peace, like a mirage, never lasted. Somewhere below deck, a shout would erupt, a rat sighting, a misplaced spoon, or yet another sailor discovering that their hammock had been colonized by a particularly assertive crab. And just like that, the ship would lurch back to life. Soon, we shall hear of the wind, when it does return, and how its insistent push will carry these men toward the Spice Islands, where the air smells less of sweat and more of cinnamon, at least from a distance. By now, you've become a seasoned, albeit sleep-deprived honorary sailor on a 17th century VOC spice ship, bobbing along the Indian Ocean like a cork in a very sweaty soup. At this point in the voyage, the combination of heat, tedium, and the indistinct possibility that time itself has curled up and died somewhere in the rigging begins to take its toll. The Equator is no fan of drama after all. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or fanfare. You simply sail into a part of the world where up and down trade places, compasses twitch nervously, and everyone's skin becomes permanently damp. This is when the elegant madness of maritime rituals begins. Crossing the Equator wasn't just navigational. For sailors of the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, a stylish corporation whose approach to human resources might kindly be described as a touch aggressive, passing into the southern hemisphere meant one thing. It was time to meet King Neptune. Yes, that King Neptune, the god of the sea, or at least his extremely convincing impersonator, usually performed by a shipmate with enough facial hair and imagination to command a trident made from broken mop handles. The Equator crossing ceremony was half hazing ritual, half aquatic theatre, and entirely a way to keep sailors from flipping overboard out of sheer boredom. Sailors who hadn't crossed the Equator before, known as greenhorns, would find themselves on the receiving end of Neptune's majestic silliness. First came the summons, perhaps delivered by a ship's fiddler dramatically reading a scroll of dubious handwriting. Then, the greenhorn might be shaved using a rusty hoop and lard for shaving cream, while other crewmen banged on pots and declared the sea's judgment with great merriment and likely mild concussions. The true purpose of this soggy theatre? Well, aside from giving everyone a reason to cackle like lunatics in the heat, initiations among the VOC seafarers served a quiet cultural function, transforming half-starved strangers into tightly bonded survivors of ceremonial nonsense. Nothing unites like shared absurdity, especially if it involves being dunked in a barrel while Neptune belly laughs through a seaweed beard. Of course, not every greenhorn emerged unscathed. Some ceremonies had a darker edge, depending on the temperament of Neptune and the amount of alcohol his court had consumed. Yet in many cases, the ritual served as a memory, a strange, salty badge of passage. You'd endured the crossing, the delirium, the prank shaving. You now belonged. Meanwhile, in the background of this oceanic theatre, the ship creaked softly, like an old man muttering in his sleep. The sails rippled gently as the trade winds guided her ever onward, south toward the Spice Islands and away from European winter. The smell of the tropics began to sneak in. Coconut husk from passing isles, the phantom sweetness of cloves still thousands of miles away. The stars nudged new constellations into view each night. Southern Cross blinked into existence, a silent reminder that the world had shifted and that your understanding of it must now shift too. For the Dutch, stern Calvinists in starched collars who had accidentally built a maritime empire while just trying to make their soup taste better. The Equator transformed into something spiritual. Not necessarily religious, but a liminal space. A line you crossed in the sweat of night, uncertain of what waited in the south and unable to go back. Below deck, the air had thickened to the density of syrup. Even rats walked slower. The ship's doctor, lucky enough to possess a vaguely optimistic diagnosis book, might occasionally emerge from his quarters to mutter about miasma, before taking a dignified nap in a hammock shaped like a low-hanging smile. And while the greenhorns were drying off from their dunkings and brushing sea biscuit crumbs out of their ears, in the captain's quarters, the real decisions brewed. The maps rustled faintly, the ink sweated on the page. There were islands ahead, ports where pepper grew on tangled green vines, harbours that smelled like nutmeg dreams and clove forests. But to reach them, the worst storms still lay ahead. Sultry crescendos of tropical rage, monsoon squalls and whirlpools of ambition waited just beyond the horizon, where cloud and sea conspired against man and mast. Still, as Neptune returned to his cabin, which looked suspiciously like a storage closet, the ship pressed on, creaking in her rhythmic slumber. And tomorrow would bring hints of cinnamon on the breeze, and rumours of Java whispered through damp corridors. By now, you've grown accustomed to the peculiar rhythms of life aboard a Dutch East India Company ship, rising with the shrieks of gulls that haven't been seen in weeks, dining on food so dry it could absorb the very humidity you're trying to escape, and falling asleep to the creaking lullaby of wood strained by both ocean and politics. But if there was one moment each day that united the entire ship's crew in quiet dread, it was noon. Not because of chores or prayers or the agonizing monotony, but because of the sun. Now yes, the sun in general isn't controversial. It grows crops, lights up faces, warms kittens. But this was equatorial noonday sun, the sort that fell with a smirk, bore down with intent, and filtered through the rigging like molten gold poured by a particularly malicious god. On paper, equatorial sailing sounded like a grand idea. Speed, warm currents, a straighter path to the spice-laden east. But reality had, as usual, filed its complaint. Let's talk about sweat. Not the handsome, glowing kind they put in movies, no. This was weaponized perspiration. This was sweat with ambition. The lowest deck became a hammock of humidity, a kind of moist purgatory, where shirts gave up completely and existed solely as suggestion. Sailors shed uniforms or more often wore them half-committed, trousers rolled up, shirts flapping open, hats repurposed as hand fans. The ship's cat, once perky and judgmental, now a sagging cushion of feline regret. Even rats took siestas. The officers, naturally, had it slightly better. A good hat, perhaps even a whiff of lemon-soaked linen, though that too wilted by 1 p.m. The captain's quarters, generously adorned with faded Persian carpets and maps curling at the edges, began to smell of ambition, citrus, and damp socks. But the heat, it did something to time itself. Minutes oozed by. Watches felt longer, tempers shorter. Sailors hallucinated mountains, breezes, Swedish winters, Parisian bidets. The barrel of drinking water, chained under tarpaulin amidships, was a sacred reliquary. Men approached it reverently, scooping out liquid the temperature of gently reheated tea, sighing as if it were nectar straight from the clouds. And then there was the smell. Ah yes, perhaps you were hoping I'd avoid this. But history is, after all, an aromatic affair. Mix 100 men, several dozen goat skins, salted fish stacked like booklets, the occasional lemon peel tossed with optimism, and every failure of colonial plumbing ever conceived, and you'll have the bouquet. A ship's cook once reportedly fainted in his own galley during an unusually windless week off the coast of Java. Not from any specific illness, but simply ambiance. To escape it, some men found solitude in small tasks, polishing brass bells, sewing patches, reorganizing the same 3 socks. Others turned to philosophy, or at least to arguing whether you could fall off the edge of the world drunk and still land in heaven if your mother had been virtuous. But perhaps the most ironically popular ritual was the ship-wide obsession with the daily noon measurement of position. Not because navigation was exciting, but because noon meant the sun was highest. And once it reached zenith, it began, finally, to descend. Shade, that rare and priceless commodity, would begin to creep back onto the deck like a shy guest at a funeral. The quartermaster, squinting like a baked owl, would hoist the cross-staff or backstaff or whatever staff was least warped that day. Assisted by a lad with good aim and low aspirations, he tracked the sun's angle grudgingly while trying not to go blind. Latitude was estimated, complaints noted in the logbook in very proper ink, and then men crawled back to their slumps, grateful that noon had passed. Though, speaking of shadows, of things falling away and things to come, rumours had begun to bubble up from those quiet corners below deck. Whispers of an island soon ahead, one that wasn't on the company's official charts, a place sailors talked about in hushed tones when the lanterns burned low, a speck of green and gold rising from the trade wind's breath. But that story waits patiently just beyond the horizon. Ah, the Equator, that sun-punched line of Earth's middle belt, where the seas bake and the air drapes itself onto your skin like a warm, wet towel. It's at this particular latitude that the brave, or perhaps profoundly desperate, men of the Dutch East India Company found themselves at the mercy of the world's steamiest geography. And by steamy, we aren't talking romance novel steamy. No swashbuckling shirt buttons undone, no flirtatious sea maidens, just sweat, gallons, the kind that slid down your back and filled your shoes before breakfast. Life aboard a VOC spice ship near the equator was a blend of coconut-scented paradise and faintly lemon-sour purgatory. The air was thick enough to chew and generally hotter than a blacksmith's forge during rush hour. Shade, not unless you counted the dubious sliver beneath a badly patched sail, which already had 3 men trying to play dead underneath it. In their infinite ingenuity, the Dutchmen had anticipated many perils on their spice-hauling voyages: pirates, storms, mutiny, awkward silences at dinner with the captain. They had not fully anticipated what happens when you combine woolen garments, salted meat, and an equatorial sun powerful enough to cook an egg on the cannon. Let's talk about the smells, because you absolutely would not last a day without clenching at least one nostril. A VOC ship near the equator was essentially a floating stew of humanity and hope, simmering gently in its own brine. The livestock, yes, they brought full-sized cows aboard, were never quite house-trained. The barrels of fish had long passed apology and entered the stage of olfactory revenge. And the sailors, well, let's just say baths were frowned upon, unless you counted being caught in a tropical downpour while crying softly. And then, we mustn't ignore the ship's kitchen, if we can generously call a corner with a fire hazard and questionable pans a kitchen. The cook, often affectionately nicknamed things like Old Grease Thumb or Sooty Jan, produced meals with such indefinable flavors that even the rats occasionally declined. The star dish near the equator, moldy biscuit stew with a generous topping of, well, more biscuit. It sat in your stomach like a cannonball, but at least it didn't require dental insurance. Oh, and hydration. How quaint. The barrels of drinking water turned suspicious within days. The clever fellows of the VOC tried their best to filter and ration, but by the time your ship had reached the horizontal ring of fire known as the equator, your daily ration of water tasted like regret and a hint of tow, which naturally meant many simply turned to beer. Warm, flat, potentially bug-infused beer. But hey, at least it was mildly less hydrating. Now, remember the sun-baked deck? Those lucky enough not assigned to rope coiling duty or rat chasing had another task, the art of not passing out. Passing out meant, at minimum, a sun-cooked back and your bunkmate rifling through your secret licorice stash. At worst, it meant being assumed dead and nearly tossed overboard after a particularly dramatic faint. It's worth noting that while we modern creatures may recoil in horror at these living conditions, VOC sailors at the time thought themselves quite lucky. After all, they were being paid, eventually, and a man who returned from the Indies with pay in hand and both legs attached was suddenly the most eligible bachelor in any Dutch fishing village with a pulse. Those who lasted near the equator did so by developing what can only be described as sweaty determination. Shirtless and sun-splotched, they adapted, sometimes fashioning tricorn hats out of roasted cabbage leaves for shade. They told endless stories at night, many certainly fabricated, about sea monsters, coconut women, and how they once beat heatstroke by simply thinking cold thoughts while lying very still next to a barrel of pickles. And yet, amidst all this discomfort, something rather marvelous occurred. Humans somehow endured. They complained, absolutely. They bickered and itched and groaned. But they pressed on, driven by salt, spice, and scandalous dreams of profit. So next time you find yourself fanning your face in a summer heat wave, just remember, you're not aboard a 17th century VOC ship, wearing a wool tunic and sipping lukewarm beer that's 30% bug. Perspective is everything. And as that dragon's breath sun begins to ease itself under the sea and the crew start their humid snores across the wooden planks, we begin to drift toward a quieter hour, when things got a bit weirder. The equator, as it happens, wasn't just sun and sweat. There was also something mysterious and perhaps mildly absurd, lurking in the rituals that sailors performed when crossing that invisible line. The horizon had turned to syrup. That's how one sailor put it anyway, after staring at the same molten orange line for hours on end, somewhere just above the Sumatran Straits. The VOC ship, Duifken, creaked like an old man in a yoga class, sails sagging with indifference. The trade winds were indecisive, like a poet choosing lunch, and the heat was so heavy it had opinions. You didn't walk the deck so much as stew gently upon it. By this point in the voyage, reality softened into something closer to marmalade. You woke up sweaty, fell asleep stickier, and in between those noble moments, tried not to argue with a pigeon or hallucinate that the cat was plotting a mutiny. Sometimes it was. Even the rats had started loitering with a kind of sarcastic nonchalance. One could only admire their tenacity and their terrible grammar. Officially, we were somewhere near the equator, which, in 17th century Dutch marine lingo, meant somewhere awful, hot, and distant enough to make you question the decisions of your ancestors. A sailor might take a long look at a blister forming on his hand from hauling ropes and think, "This is what nutmeg tastes like in Europe. Really?" The irony, of course, was that the thing slowly turning our brains into boiled custard, spice, was the very reason we stayed. It's hard to overstate how culturally unprepared Europe was for nutmeg. This was a society that considered porridge a triumph, so when the VOC arrived bearing perfume power powders that could disguise the flavour of a questionable meat pie, people lost their minds. But no one lost their minds quite like the people stuck on these ships. To pass the time, the crew invented games. There was the ever-popular "What's That Smell?", followed by "Guess Whose Footprint That Is?" and "Is that a cloud or a sail?" Spoiler, it was always a cloud. Hilarity would ensue when Jacob, the ship's third mate and least artistically gifted crew member, attempted to draw albatrosses in charcoal. They looked more like flying potatoes, but morale is morale. Below deck, things were damp. Not metaphorically, but literally damp. The kind of damp that made your biscuits soft and your shirt resemble a dishcloth left out in a thunderstorm. The hammocks, strung low and swaying to the rhythm of boredom, offered little relief. You'd fall asleep dreaming of ice, imaginary glaciers the size of your mother's candlestick cupboard, and wake up to the sound of someone mumbling in their sleep about cinnamon. Mornings were for rationing water, scurrying cockroaches, a shipwide sport, and hearing what new thing Willem had decided to rub garlic on. He claimed it prevented fever. It did not. It did, however, secure him a private corner of the deck for 2 entire days. And then there was the matter of shaving. Sailors didn't, as a rule, unless they were trying to impress a passing frigate or were on imaginary dates with women they swore lived in Lisbon. Staring at their reflections in a polished spoon, they gently stroke their beards and sigh longingly, "Anna Maria," who may or may not have been a real person. The VOC didn't issue uniforms, just basic clothes, and the overwhelming sense that your skin was a temporary inconvenience. Sunburn was inevitable. Shirts bleached to a ghost pale colour, and hats were patched with so many odds and ends, they looked more like regret than fabric. To cover your feet was an optional luxury. To have anything dry to put on them, a minor miracle. Eventually, somewhere in this surreal tangle of days and baked thoughts, we'd spot another ship, a dot on the horizon, wobbling slightly in the heat. Anticipation would swell. Was it Dutch, Portuguese, English, or just another self-important cloud? Peering through the spyglass, someone would mutter, "I think it's us." Everyone laughed. Somewhere, a monkey shrieked in agreement. As the tropics pressed closer and the air turned from syrup to soup, the crew grew quiet. Even jokes had to cool down. The equator was within reach, a melancholy line drawn across water, superstition, and sweat. Sailors prepared themselves for the age-old ceremony, crossing the line. A moment steeped in salt, shaving cream, Neptune costumes, and alarming misunderstandings of mythological hierarchy. But that part of the journey, well, that curious theatrical silliness, will lean our sleepy thoughts toward it next. There was a special kind of despair that bloomed somewhere between the 5th and 6th week of sailing along the equator, right when your sweat had replaced your personality, and your only expressed emotion was a slow blink of apathy. This was the precise moment most VOC sailors met their fate not through tempest or pirate, but by something far less romantic, heat-induced muttering, and a wooden ship filled with salt-cured tempers. Now, the equator isn't just hot. It's a damp, meaty kind of heat. It hangs on your skin like a clingy toddler, follows you into your dreams, and renders clothes utterly symbolic. Linen shirts became sacrificial offerings to armpits and salt sores, and the air, oh the air, had all the charm of an undercooked onion wrapped in wet wool. At this point in the voyage, the Dutch crew had generally accepted that deodorant wouldn't be invented for another few centuries, and that personal space was a miraculous theory that applied to no one. The narrow bunks below deck hadn't purpled with mildew so much as they developed their own personality. Berths had names. The worst one was called Soggy Willem, both for its location near the bilge and the unfortunate fate of a sailor who mistook a full chamber pot for his hat. Speaking of chamber pots, let's dwell there, if we dare. When sailing in the tropical zones, they filled up faster than your patience. Imagine 200 men atop each other, without modern plumbing, crammed inside what was basically a floating wardrobe soaked in vinegar and dreams of nutmeg. Now, toss in gastrointestinal distress, because why not? And you'll understand the true miracle of maritime stoicism. But it wasn't all stench and sunstroke. There was humour in the madness, a sort of collective delusion that manifested in song. Not the elegant sea shanties you might picture, but improvised verses sung poorly and loudly about mouldy bread, mysterious foot rashes, and the exact shade of the captain's sunburn. One particularly popular ballad among the lower-ranking sailors was titled "Oh Ye Weevils in My Biscuit," which featured an impressively dramatic bridge about attempting to negotiate with said weevils for shared custody of the remaining crumbs. The biscuit situation, by the way, had deteriorated to a point best described as crunch adjacent. Hardtack, that famously unyielding plank of flour and hope, had become a universe unto itself. Sailors didn't eat it so much as challenge it to a duel. It wasn't uncommon to see a man tapping his biscuit against the hull to compare structural integrity. The biscuit usually won. Now, as delirious as the heat made things, routines persisted. Every crew member had duties, and temperature was no excuse. The sails still needed trimming, the deck still demanded swabbing, ideally before the sun turned it into volcanic glass. One poor man, known only as Albertus the Flat, once sat down for a midday rest and sizzled like smoked herring in the pan. The smell lingered longer than his dignity. One daily ritual, however, became more cherished the nearer they drew to the Spice Islands: the evening watch. When the sun slipped behind the sea in a tangerine exhale, a cooler wind would sometimes bless the deck. It was during these twilight moments that even the most irritable crew members found a speck of peace. They'd stare silently at the indigo water, listening to the creak of the rigging and the lazy flap of canvas. Sometimes someone would produce a pipe, and though the tobacco was often more mould than leaf, the ritual remained sacred. It was then, in these dusky breathers, that men dreamed of land. Not just any land, but lush groves fragrant with cloves and nutmeg, where beds didn't sweat back at you and you could eat something that hadn't once been debated by rats. Of course, none of them knew what awaited them on shore, that the tropics had teeth of their own. But for now, they gazed ahead, lulled into serenity by the surf and broken Dutch lullabies. And so they drifted on, a timber-clad fever dream sliding westward under constellations unfamiliar but faithful. For better or worse, the equator was behind them. Insects, intrigue, and insanity awaited. But first, the smell of cinnamon on the wind, and the quiet promise of land. Imagine a place where the sun doesn't just shine, it interrogates. An unrelenting golden inquisition from above, grilling everything below like a particularly judgmental rotisserie chef. Welcome to the equatorial doldrums, not so much a place as a condition, a tropical nowhere, wrapped in a sweaty eternity where time gave up keeping count. As the VOC's bold merchant vessels crept beneath the sun's equatorial gaze, they sometimes found themselves in this dreaded liminal realm. Sailors had a special name for it, the dead calm. Of course, dead described more than just the atmosphere. This was the maritime equivalent of being stuck in an elevator with 200 unshowered men, a barrel of salted fish, and no idea when the doors would open, or if they ever would. You have to understand, wind was everything. It was the ship's engine, its breath, its dance partner. And the doldrums, they stole it all. No wind, no movement. The sails sagged like wilted flags. The ocean stretched out like a sheet of bruised glass. Too still, too knowing. Life aboard became increasingly odd. Men paced the decks in loose rotations, swatting imaginary insects off their faces and engaging in long arguments over the proper way to cut a lime. Others just lay on the planks, dreaming out loud. One sailor reportedly began an affair with the ship's bell. He called it Maria. Maria never judged him for sweating through his clothes while standing completely still. The heat, you see, did things to the mind. To combat the oppressive torpor, captains resorted to what today we might call team-building exercises, and what they, more honestly, called discipline. Barrels were scrubbed again, ropes coiled, then uncoiled, then lovingly recoiled for no reason other than to avoid madness. Men were taught dances, yes, dances, so their bodies wouldn't atrophy. There are reliable records of Dutch sailors collectively learning the minuet in full sun, feet shuffling stiffly against the deck, imagining themselves in crisp jackets and powdered wigs instead of wearing, essentially, soggy underpants. And then there were the duels. Not always with swords, a luxury, but with fish bones, mop handles, or just viciously hurtful haiku. The resulting casualties were minor but deeply theatrical. The ship's cook, who already operated somewhere between artist and tormentor, found new experimental madness during these quiet days. With rum and spices dwindling, he turned to culinary improvisation. Salted biscuit stew and gruel à la mode essence made their haunting debuts. If culinary disappointment were a spice, the VOC ships carried barrels of it. Perhaps worst of all, the smell. Oh, dear listener, the smell. By the time a ship had spent 4 windless days beneath the equator, it became an olfactory museum of suffering. Imagine unwashed feet, boiled tar, pickled cabbage, and 8 types of wet dog, all aging together in a wooden closet. Now add fear, desperation, and a pervasive note of human cheese. It is said that during one particularly stagnant voyage, the scent became so potent that the ship's cat simply walked off the edge. But not all was despair. There were moments of eerie wonder. Nights fell suddenly and brilliantly, like a stage curtain pulled down by the stars. The heat lingered, but the skies danced. Bioluminescent plankton turned the waves into stardust. With no land for hundreds of miles, the universe felt closer, as if Neptune himself might lean over the railing and whisper a joke into your ear. Some sailors composed verses then. Bad poetry bloomed like mildew in the dark. Moon on water, fish are mocking me again. Why is everything wet? A masterpiece of desperation. And just when the men began to eye the sails as potential hammocks for their eternal rest, the breeze would return. A tiny puff at first, tentative, like nature reconsidering. Then another, and then it came, the rush, The wind galloped in like a long-lost friend, filling the sails, lifting the spirits, and giving the ship her voice again. Creaks, flaps, the happy laughter of rigging. They moved, and in maritime tradition, they celebrated this resurrection by getting back to the business of spicy global capitalism, as well as swabbing everything that had quietly fermented in those stagnant hours. But survival in the tropics was never as simple as waiting for the wind, for as soon as the sails billowed again, the storms came sniffing round the corner, curious and rude, and utterly without manners. Somewhere between the southern tip of India and the ragged edge of Sumatra, our creaking VOC spice ship was enduring what sailors euphemistically called a period of calm. This was no tranquil stillness with hammocks and gentle breezes. No, this was equatorial stillness, the kind where the sun feels like it's personally offended by your existence and decides to sit on your chest for 16 hours a day. The doldrums. Didn't that sound poetic? Almost like a forgotten Victorian children's novel. But any poet who had actually spent a week motionless on the sweat-slicked planks of a Dutch vessel would have thrown their pen into the sea and wept. Without wind, the sails hung loose like the last clean shirt of a homesick crewman. The ocean, usually an agreeable partner in the voyage, had turned into a gleaming sheet of melted glass. We moved only as much as the tempers of the crew allowed, which on day 4 of what was essentially a floating sauna was approaching mutinous levels of irritable. Let's talk hydration, shall we? Barrels of fresh water were as precious as nutmeg and came with the delightful extra seasoning of algae, tang, and things that were probably once-legged. You'd be lucky to sip half a pint a day, and even luckier if it went down before a desperate cabin boy tried to barter for it with a worn shoe, a dented spoon, or, in one dramatic case, a poem he'd written about dewdrops in the mid-ocean sun. And oh, the sun. It didn't simply bear down from above. It conspired with every surface to attack from below and both sides. The deck became a frying pan for your feet, assuming you had any leather left on your shoes. Shirts turned to salt-crusted rags, skin fried into one of just 3 colors: lobster red, parchment pale, or the alarming purple of someone who may need to lie down. Shade was fought over like a noble inheritance. A square foot behind the mizzenmast could inspire full-blown philosophical arguments and occasionally duels of an extremely sluggish nature. Then came the flies. Not flies as you know them now, modern, distracted, neurotic bugs with short attention spans. These were colonial flies. Ambitious, opportunistic, persistent. They had little uniforms, a clear sense of hierarchy, and a deep, unwavering affection for your nose. Even the rats were cranky. And if you've never witnessed a seasick rat looking judgmentally at a sunstroke sailor while chewing on a hardtack biscuit, you haven't truly visited the darker corners of maritime history. Now, some readers at this point may be wondering, why not simply go for a swim? To which the Dutch sailor of 1623 would say, in a hoarse and slightly delirious tone, because the last time Jan tried, something brushed his leg and he screamed so loud we gave him a promotion just to keep him quiet. The oceans weren't exactly well mapped then. Every mysterious bump, ripple, or shadow past 20 feet off the stern was whispered to be a kraken, a sea demon, or worse, a Portuguese ship. And besides, there were rules. The VOC was very big on rules. You couldn't just throw yourself overboard without scheduling it between inventory checks and the 3rd round of fungal foot inspections. Oh, and you'd need permission from the bosun, who by this point was mostly made of grog and rage. Stifling boredom was another enemy. Once the cards went soggy and the dice disappeared down the grating, the crew turned to storytelling, often about mermaids that definitely existed, storms they'd survived by sheer handsomeness, and lands where cinnamon grew naturally on the sides of gentle hills like nature's own bakery. One man swore he'd seen a flying squid. Another quietly confessed he once loved a parrot more than any woman should love a parrot. We did not press for details, and yet, for all its miseries, there was a strange rhythm to life in the doldrums. As nerves frayed and shirts disintegrated, you could almost, if you squinted through the sweat and salt, begin to understand how someone might romanticize it later. When memory had the decency to blur the smells and round off the edges, it was almost peaceful. And just as the last cockroach tap-danced into a biscuit barrel and the first mate was considering inventing a new water-based religion, a single gust of wind flirted with the edge of the upper sail. It was too late to believe it, and too early to cheer, but it was something. Sailors lifted their heads like ancient statues coming to life. The lookout squinted into the blazing haze, and the old helmsman whispered a prayer to some salty Dutch sea god with a beard made of kelp. Something was stirring, and what stirred next came with clouds. The Indian Ocean, in all her blistering glory, did not believe in the concept of mercy, especially not for pale, sweat-slicked Dutchmen aboard an overburdened VOC spy ship in the 17th century. While maps romanticized her as a silky blue carpet between continents, the reality was far less hospitable and significantly more aromatic, though not in a good way. By this point on the voyage, the ship's cargo hold had transformed into something between an exotic apothecary and a particularly determined onion. You see, VOC ships weren't just sailing vessels. They were floating spice cabinets with conditions ideal for neither man nor nutmeg. Cloves, mace, pepper, and cinnamon bled their mysterious perfumes into every nook and cranny of the wooden hull, creating an olfactory cocktail that could knock a bosun off his balance. Imagine living inside a soup, but the soup is made entirely of sweaty sailors and highly flammable plant material. The air was thick enough to chew. At any given hour, someone was fainting, sweating profusely, or discovering a rash in a place that was both private and alarmingly chafed. And that's not even considering the pets, by which I mean rats. The true monarchs of VOC vessels, the real captains, long-tailed diplomats of mischief. These rats, having already achieved tenure at Sea Rat University, were masters at stealing hardtack, nesting in spice sacks, and performing unlicensed dentistry on sleeping crew members. Above deck, life was not markedly better. The equatorial sun tarred every inch of exposed skin with joyless persistence. Sailors fashioned makeshift shade from stitched-together canvas in hopes of escaping its punishment. But the heat always found them, laughing. The tar on deck grew soft at midday, sticking to bare feet, while the iron fittings of the rigging glowed like stove burners. One particular sailor attempted to fry an egg directly on a cannonball one afternoon, for the amusement of his crewmates. It didn't work, but it did result in a rather oily cannon, which, for once, smelled better than the quarterdeck. Drinking water, precious as gold and as rare by this point, was carefully rationed. Each man received a daily allowance doled out in a cup that had likely shared its services with at least 3 small infestations and 1 regrettable vomiting. The taste varied by barrel, ranging from stagnant marsh funk to, is this seawater with pretensions? Occasionally, mold would form a polite crust on the surface, which sailors referred to as the beard. For fun, of course. Bathing, utterly impractical, was only attempted during storms. when rain swept the decks clean and allowed for what could generously be called rinsing. The rest of the time, sailors resorted to what historians now euphemistically describe as dry hygiene practices, which in practical terms meant scratching liberally and blaming the French. Still, there was a strange piece in the routine. The endlessly creaking timbers, the rhythmic snapping of canvas overhead, and the ever-present, mildly judgmental squawk of the ship's parrot, a prize pet who had unfortunately learned to mimic the captain's snore, formed a hypnotic backdrop. Days blurred into nights, and nights into restless half-sleeps, interrupted by the call of the watch or the sudden squabble over who'd stolen the last dried fig. The Equator was still days away, but already men spoke of it like a mystical beast. Tales of line-crossing ceremonies and Neptune's watery blessings filled the evening air. These ceremonies, designed to mockingly baptize those crossing the Equator for the first time, involved more humiliation than holiness, shaving heads, dunking in barrels, reciting oaths in faux Latin, and, most crucially, a lot of pretending you didn't mind being covered in shipboard kitchen slop for the amusement of your fellow sun-addled mariners. But that would come later. For now, the ocean stretched in all directions, calm and smug, as if daring the ship to fade into irrelevance. The stars would soon appear, dutiful and ancient, and someone would be below deck fiddling with the astrolabe, trying to prove they hadn't gotten everyone lost. Again. And above all of it, the sail strained against the humid breath of the sea as the ship drifted slowly ever onward, teetering between adventure and absurdity, carrying men too stubborn to die of boredom and too uncomfortable to sleep comfortably. Just beyond the horizon, deeper into the blazing belly of the tropics, a peculiar and surprisingly dangerous fruit awaited. Along with several misunderstandings, one suspected mutiny and a powdered wig on a tropical beach. But we'll get there in due time. There are few things in life more humbling than being outwitted by soup, and aboard a Dutch East India Company ship just north of the Equator, broth had ambitions. There it sat, in a precarious, sloshing basin nailed to the galley wall in a futile attempt to outwit physics. At every wave's command, it lunged like an indignant sea creature, stinging noses with cloves and disappointment. The ship creaked, the wind moaned, and the cook, more carpenter than culinarian, muttered something about watching your boots. The soup's got a temper today. The Equator, you see, wasn't just a line on a map. To those aboard these groaning spice caravans, it was a dispiriting middle finger from nature, a place where the heat curled around your limbs like a wet wool blanket and clung to you with the devotion of a particularly needy cat. By midday, shirt collars had surrendered, becoming crude lassos of damp cloth. At night, the stillness was a damp whisper, broken only by the fanning of palm fronds, held not by tropical trees, but by the most enterprising sailors trying to convince mosquitoes to pick another target. And here lies the cruel cosmic joke. These ships were packed to the beams with nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves. The air smelled like a cake that was taking too long to arrive. But no matter how festive the aroma, the reality was anything but celebratory. The spices may have been destined for a merchant's cabinet in Amsterdam, but on deck, they did nothing to mask the scent of scorched wood, rats with body confidence, and the unwashed optimism of underpaid men. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, had turned these ships into floating profit machines. Every square inch, from the dizzying crow's nest to the rat disco below the floorboards, was monetized. If it couldn't hold cargo, it had better hold a sailor, or at least a bucket of tar. private space? There were more ghosts per square meter than spare pillows. Hierarchies were rigid, but hammocks were shared. If someone was lucky enough to sleep in one, it probably still smelled like the last guy's boots. Let's not forget the water, because they certainly hadn't. Rainwater, when captured, was hoarded with all the glee of a miser's coin chest. The rest was stored in barrels so old and smelly they doubled as personality tests. If you could drink from one without crying, you were going places. Probably to the surgeon, sure, but places nonetheless. And that surgeon, dear listener, was less man of medicine, more enthusiastic improviser. With a collection of saws, questionable herbs, and a surgical textbook that had last seen the light of day during the Dutch Revolt, he wielded his tools like a chef with no recipes. The smell of clove might have been comforting had it not been used to mask the scent of recently sterilized steel. That is, sterilized by the day's sun and somebody spitting on it. Still, amid this molasses-thick heat and maritime funk, life went on. Dice games whispered beneath moonlight. A fiddler would sometimes pluck out eerie tunes stolen from wind and memory, and the carpenter, when he wasn't fixing planks or chasing soup, carved little ships from spare coconut shells. Everyone, even the most cynical, clung to superstitions and stories. Mermaids in the distance, flying fish as omens, and the hope that reaching Batavia would not only mean money, but sturdier hammocks. Or at the very least, fewer rats. Maybe cushier ghosts. As the ship slid across the equator's infinite blue, surrounded by ocean that sulked under an unforgiving sky, tempers flared and then fizzled like wet matches. The sun didn't set so much as retreat behind a veil of orange mist, exhausted from glaring down all day. Night would fall gently, like a weary promise, and the candles below deck would flicker into tired halos of waxy gold. And while the captain charted course and the helmsman muttered to the constellations, somewhere near the stern, a dog-eared copy of The Art of Navigation lay open, not to pages on stars or trade winds, but one highly thumbed section titled, delicately, What to Do If You've Completely Lost Track of Where You Are But Must Appear Confident. For now, all seemed adrift but intact, at least until morning. And in that stillness, wrapped in spice-scented air and slow swaying wood, the crew dreamed. Not of fortune, not of home, but of clean shirts and lukewarm soup that minded its place. Soon, the wind would bring more than heat. It would bring sails on the horizon. And not all company is welcome. Somewhere just north of the equator, where the sea rolls like molten sapphire and the wind forgets what a breeze is supposed to feel like, the men aboard the Dutch East India Company's spice ships began to suspect they might in fact be soup. Not metaphoric soup, not the we're in trouble kind. Literal, aromatic human stock steeping slowly in their own perspiration beneath a sky that had clearly misplaced its off switch. The VOC sailors, pragmatic as they were, had many names for this part of the journey, most of them unprintable, and nearly all of them delivered with equal parts sweat and despair. The doldrums lay like an invisible hammock across their path, a windless belt of stillness where the sails sagged, the air sulked, and tempers grew brittle under the tyranny of tropical inertia. Oh, it sounded romantic in the maps. The intertropical convergence zone, swirling with mystery and high-pressure systems, until you were actually in it, at which point you'd rather have been swirling anywhere else. Put simply, nothing happened here, which meant everything happened here. When the wind died, so did reason. With the cannons silent, the sea tame, and the horizon stuck on repeat, the greatest adversary became the hours, and how many of them you could fill before you started seeing your shipmates in stew-like hallucinations. The VOC ships, for all their might and administrative glory, had not solved the problem of boredom under oppressive heat. And so, as any self-made sailor would, the crew improvised. There were games, of course. Nautical chess, a maddening variant played with pebbles and buttons on a grid scratched into the deck, always at the risk of losing a knight to a surprise gust. Rap poker was less dignified and more literal than you'd hope. And then there was the age-old pastime of trying to guess who would snap first, a gamble that more than once had ended with someone swan diving heroically into a sea devoid of rescue plans. Hygiene, always tenuous at best, took on a sort of theoretical role here. Bathing was a whimsical memory of land-based life, and bodily fragrances were exchanged like awkward handshakes in cramped quarters. The scent below deck was described by one sailor as fermented vinegar with undertones of despair, though this may have been generous. Clothes clung loyally to skin, both soaked through with brine, sweat, and perhaps a splash of spilled grog. Or was that rat blood? Best not to ask. Even the officers, perched loftily with their fancier breeches and slightly less damp hats, grew prickly in their lace collars. The captain, usually a pillar of starch and snarls, began to speak dreamily about the wind, as if it were an old flame he hoped would write back. Navigation ceased to require instruments. After all, they weren't going anywhere. And conversations became dangerously philosophical. "So," murmured one gunner one night, fanning himself with a stretch of biscuit cloth, "if the earth is round, where exactly is down right now?" No one had the energy to answer. Meals helped somewhat. The cook, a man with a moustache made entirely of soot, did his best with pickled fish and hardtack so tough you could shave cannonballs with it. Rumours spread of a secret cache of spices intended for Batavia, tucked somewhere deep in the hold, leading to several midnight plots to accidentally season dinner. These always failed, largely because descending into the spice hold meant re-entering the real belly of the ship, a place as dark, damp, and unforgiving as a poem written by mildew. Yet, even here, where tempers frayed and sweat pooled in nooks you didn't know you had, there were moments of odd, sticky camaraderie. A screeching parrot taken aboard in Goa provided comic relief by shrieking insults in multilingual obscenities. A makeshift theatre was staged using bedsheets, with one bearded bosun performing a one-man drama as the ghost of the wind. And at night, when the sea finally exhaled and the stars pirouetted above like distant fires, even the grimiest souls on board felt something like awe clutching at their ribs. "Almost makes you forgive the smell," someone whispered once, staring at a galaxy smeared across the sky like billed ink. Almost. Still, no sailor lasted long out here without growing weirder than the flying fish. Isolation tampered with logic, sweat tampered with sanity, and together they brewed a quiet sort of madness under the equator. But as the air began to shiver with the rusty promise of a breeze, and the sails gave one reluctant lurch like old lungs remembering how to breathe, a curious hope stirred on board. Of course, hope on a VOC ship was always toxic in small doses. But in the distance, something was changing. Something greener, something spice-laden. With any luck, and a strong enough stomach, the crew might yet see land, or at least something like it. For now, sleep comes slowly on the creaking hull, and the sea, as ever, keeps whispering strange truths to those willing to listen through the heat. And just beyond that horizon, not yet visible but very near, things are about to get considerably more fragrant and far, far more bureaucratic. By the time the VOC ship Hetwaard van Oost-India limped into the tropics, its crew had already witnessed more toenail-related injuries than a Swiss podiatrist sees in a lifetime. But as the equator loomed like some invisible and humid finish line, a new flavor of madness set in. A soup of salt-crusted clothing, heat-induced visions, and the general sense that the sun had it out for everybody personally. Now, crossing the equator wasn't just a matter of celestial geography. Oh no, it came with traditions, deities, and quite a bit of nausea. Sailors who'd never crossed before were dubbed polywogs, and they were subjected to elaborate initiation rituals that began sometime in the late 15th century and, more or less tragically, survived into the 18th. The VOC adopted them with the same zeal they applied to efficient bookkeeping and questionable hygiene. As Neptune's line drew nearer, the ship turned into something resembling a floating theatre troupe that's been locked in a sauna. The veteran sailors, self-appointed sons of Neptune, donned makeshift costumes stitched from rope, tar, and broken dreams. There was always a Neptune, usually the ship's chirpiest drunk, with a trident carved from whatever spare lumber could be pried off without sinking the vessel. Then came his court, a barber with cold sea water, a judge with a mop for a wig, and an executioner who wielded a week-old haddock like a weapon of divine justice. Polywogs were summoned one by one, accused of crimes such as slouching under sail, or consuming the ship's rations as if they were attending a banquet. Each was sentenced to some outlandish penalty, usually involving a dunk in a barrel of seawater, or a forced marriage to a coconut dressed as a mermaid. The heat made these events especially delirious. On more than one occasion, someone passed out mid-dunking and had to be fished out with a boat hook and several apologies. You, dear listener, were imagining escaping the equatorial sun by hiding below deck, weren't you? But down there the air was thick as stew, and the scent, a heady mixture of wet peppercorns, mildew, and socks that had gained sentience. The timbers groaned with heat, the iron bolts sizzled to the touch, and one unfortunate sailor swore he saw his own reflection cry. And yet, amid all this nonsense, business continued. Spices were inventoried. Cinnamon bark was aired to prevent moulding. The cloves, precious as silver, had to be turned by hand to avoid rot. Nutmeg sacks were obsessively studied for signs of worms, which rather startlingly turned out to have their own ecosystem. Tiny, blooming colonies with ambitions no less vulgar than conquest. On deck, tempers flared and were quickly dampened by exhaustion. Fights were often carried out in the slow-motion way of those who are too tired to be truly committed. One argument over a missing spoon ended after both combatants fell asleep mid-duel, tangled in an aggressive but arbitrary embrace. Water, sweet, life-giving water, had turned questionable 3 weeks ago. Barrels once clear now played host to all manner of floaters and flora. Sailors strained the liquid with socks, faith, or both. Beer, despite being lukewarm and tangy, was the drink of choice. It was safer. Slightly. Letters home were written in great seriousness, despite the fact that delivery was at best hypothetical. One seaman composed sonnets to a woman he insisted was waiting in Amsterdam, though every other sailor was sure she was invented, like Santa Claus or accurate wage records. Still, he wrote, and it brought him peace. On rare days, rain would fall in sudden theatrical outbursts. Men emerged from below like beetles from rotted wood, lifting mouths to the sky while catching what they could in pots, buckets, and even their own hats. For a few brief hours, clothes were washed, spirits lifted, and body odor retreated to a manageable howl. As the sun sank crimson behind thunderclouds and a double rainbow performed something close to a conjuring trick on the horizon, the crew grew quiet. Some watched the sky silently, as if terrified of where they were, and more so of where they were going. You might think, gently dozing now, that hardships like these would stir mutiny or panic, but somehow they didn't. The VOC seamen had their rituals, their fish-wielding Neptunes, their wormy nutmegs and tepid beer. It was a world of its own logic, seasoned with desperation and clove. A floating world too hot to think in, too stubborn to sink, and just dreamlike enough to slide into the next chapter. And so, as the salt-crusted hull of the VOC spice ship creaked and groaned in the moon-drenched swell of a sunburnt ocean, we arrive at the final whisper of this voyage, a final glance down a splintered gangplank into a world of cloves, curses, and very questionable choices made by men in puffed breeches. The air, always thick near the equator, now seemed to carry the weight of the entire adventure. Dense with spice, sweat, swindle, and the scent of mouldy biscuits. As the crew scuffled about in the starlight, hammocks gently swinging with the waves, a few gold-trimmed officers sat beneath flickering lanterns, hiding their dysentery under powdered wigs and polite conversation. Tomorrow, they thought, might be the day they drop anchor near Batavia, or possibly just drift toothlessly into another week of doldrums and regrets. The sea decided that sort of thing. The Dutch East India Company may have spread its maps and drawn sharp, straight routes across oceans, but the wind had a different sense of humour, less cartographic, more chaotic. You, the imaginary passenger still curled in the shadowed cargo, now nearly a prune from humidity, would by now have learned the most sacred law of spice ships, that surviving the journey mattered more than ever reaching the ports. Batavia sounded tempting in the brochures, sure, a tropical jewel waiting to receive nutmegs, pepper sacks, and sailors who look like they've just lost a wrestling match with a coconut crab. Turns out, it was also rife with disease, scheming bureaucrats, and mosquitoes that hunted in packs and had absolutely no respect for European colonial fashion. The Parmesan cheese you tried to sneak past the rats on day 11 is now part of a delicate ecosystem living near the mizzenmast. Someone has named it Ernst. We salute them. Even the ship's parrot has stopped swearing, having exhausted its vocabulary and its spirit. It merely stares now, a feathered existentialist, contemplating the futility of centuries. Odd to think, isn't it, that this floating barrel of ambition and salted meat would help shape the modern world, that the suffering sailors, the economic fantasies, and all the garbled Malay-Dutch bargaining mishaps would somehow ripple outwards into tea rituals in London, chili-scented mutton in Suriname, and cinnamon-sprinkled lattes in places that knew neither cinnamon nor lattes at the time. The VOC, for all its epic charts and ruinous capitalism, was built on fumbling human hands, and fumbles, as sleepers well know, become dreams or nightmares, depending on the temperature in the room and how badly the mosquito net is tucked in. Softly now, the bell strikes midnight. 1, 2. It's brass, dull from sea spray, and rings not so much with clarity as resignation. Night watch shuffles onto deck, the younger among them trying to look vicious and sober. The older ones don't bother pretending. They light pipes filled with God knows what, glance at the heavens, and try to remember if the stars up there ever once looked encouraging. Below deck, a carpenter dreams of trees, real ones, the kind that don't creak. A cook mutters recipes for imaginary ingredients, having long since used the last edible onion to bribe a sea captain who smelled like boiled despair. Somewhere near a row of leaking barrels, someone hums an old Dutch drinking song, now nearly indistinguishable from a lullaby, and in the captain's quarters, festooned with maps so wildly ambitious they scream delusion more than vision, a journal lies open. Ink dries beside a line that reads, "Sighted nothing today, camphor rations low, crew growing philosophical." Outside, the sea doesn't care. It yawns and rolls, lifting the ship as gently as it dares. The stars, filtered through sailcloth and time, begin to blur. You, weary traveller of the mind, finally allow it all to fade. The heat, the rumbling jargon of trade, the mouldy corners of global commerce. The great colonial spice machine may clatter on tens of thousands of leagues away, but here, on this narrowing velvet wave of night, you're already drifting. Let those in the hold dream of cloves and home. Let the officers pretend the world can be measured in ledgers. Let time itself forget where it left the compass. You've made it, after all, to the end of the story, even if you wouldn't have lasted a day. Sleep now. The sea is quiet, and the past can wait till morning.